This evening's lecture will focus on Mr. Carroll's recent book titled The Passage of Power, a biography of LBJ. And this is not to be confused with the NBA's LeBron James. This is the first LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Now, it's not every day that we have the privilege to hear and learn from a renowned political writer and historian. And I'm really delighted that all of you are able to take part in this very special presentation and discussion. I'm also pleased that we have a focus on Lyndon Johnson. Last fall, I had the distinct privilege of visiting the LBJ Library and Museum in Austin, Texas, and the LBJ Ranch about an hour and a half outside of Austin, which is still functioning as a cattle ranch, but is now under the auspices of the National Park Service. As you know, it served as the Texas White House during the Johnson administration. Highlights of my visit included one of the famous Texas barbecues along the Pedernales River in late afternoon, which was just beautiful. LBJ's car collection. He had a penchant for convertibles and a car that actually went into the water and out of the water. It was kind of an unusual thing. He has several cars. As well as each room in the house had 3 TV sets, including the bedroom, with ABC, NBC, and CBS. Which I think is a fitting note for the theme of the Holt lecture, which is on communications and public policy. Of course, these TVs were about 18-inch, not the kind of 50-inch we have today. Now, tonight's event marks the 4th Dennis F. and Brooks Holt Distinguished Lecture. This series illuminates the intersection of public policy and communication. It explores the relationship between effective communication and leadership, and it examines the role of knowledge and information in assessing significant public policy issues. The Holt Distinguished Lecture was established by a generous gift from Dennis Holt, a longtime member of the USC Price School's Board of Counselors, and his wife Brooks. Dennis founded Western International Media in 1970. And under his stewardship, Western became the world's largest and most diversified media management company. It changed the nature of advertising and had a tremendous influence over the advertising and media buying practices of companies in various sectors, from entertainment to retail to heavy industry. And today, Dennis is chairman and CEO of U.S. International Media and Patriot Communications, which is LLC, growing rapidly, Dennis tells me, across the country. He intended to retire and then started this little company, and next thing you know, it's a national major enterprise. So he obviously has the touch for making an entrepreneurial effort to create a great company. And I would really like to thank Dennis and Brooks for their support of the Price School and their commitment to expanding and supporting education and scholarship, especially in this critical area of the intersection of communication and public policy. And we are enormously pleased that Dennis Holt is here with us tonight. So Dennis, would you please stand and let us acknowledge your gift and support for this lectureship. Thank you very much. In addition, tonight's lecture is offered in partnership with the John and Judith Bedrosian Center on Governance in the Public Enterprise. The Bedrosian Center seeks to foster effective governance by promoting innovative scholarship, by building professional capacity in the public and nonprofit sectors, and by shaping public dialogue. Thus, tonight's discussion is a very fitting opportunity for this partnership as well. Unfortunately, the director of the Bedrosian Center was not able to be with us. He was here with us earlier, and so, oh, you. Okay, in the back is the director of the Bedrosian Center, Professor Raphael Bostic. So at this time, it's my great pleasure to introduce our Holt Distinguished Lecturer, Robert Caro. You know, I actually met Robert Caro many years ago, intellectually at least, when I was an assistant professor at Michigan State University, and I was teaching an introductory class in public administration and society, and I assigned Caro's brilliant book, The Power Broker, about the life and impact of Robert Moses and the decline of New York City. And I was captured by the beautiful, forceful prose, the compelling story, and the detailed, incisive analysis of the era and the man, Robert Moses. And I have been an ardent fan of Robert Caro ever since. As I mentioned earlier, Mr. Caro has twice received the Pulitzer Prize for biography, one for The Power Broker, for example. But what I didn't mention was that in addition to these awards, he's won almost every other single literary award that is out there, indeed far too many to list. And these distinctions underscore Mr. Caro's unique place among American political biographers. He is known as a masterful storyteller and a researcher whose books have become major national bestsellers, greeted with widespread critical acclaim. And among his most notable works is the multi-volume series, The Years of Lyndon Johnson, which span more than 30 years of Johnson's life. The first volume, Path to Power, was published in 1982, followed by Means of Ascent 8 years later. Masters of the Senate was released in 2002, and his most recent volume, The Passage of Power, was published in May of this past year. This latest book, The Passage of Power, has received tremendous praise. It was named one of the year's best books by the New York Times, Newsweek, Businessweek, The Economist, and many others. And it was named one of Time Magazine's 10 best nonfiction books of the year. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming celebrated author, biographer, and historian, Robert Caro.
That was such a lovely introduction that it reminds me of what Lyndon Johnson used to say when he got an especially nice introduction. He used to say he wished his parents were both alive to hear it, because his father would have loved it and his mother would have believed it. You know, I've mentioned that I'm on the 5th volume of my Johnson series. It reminds me of what what Winston Churchill said when he was asked how he was coming about his great biography of Lord Marlborough. And he said, I'm working on the 5th of a projected 4 volumes. Now, not to try. How's that? Better? Yeah, okay. Now, I'm not trying to compare myself with Winston Churchill, but in this one respect, it so happens we're the same, because I'm working on the 5th of a projected 4 volumes. Actually, it was originally a projected 3 volumes. I've been working on it so long that people keep asking me, don't you get bored with Lyndon Johnson? And I always say, no, the very opposite is true. It's true because I never think of my books as just a biography of Robert Moses or Lyndon Johnson. From the first time I thought of writing books, I never had the slightest interest in writing a biography just to tell the life of a great man. I never had that interest at all. I was always interested in trying to use the life of a great man to explore the great forces that shape his times, particularly one force, political power. Why am I so interested in that? I guess because, you see, we're in a democracy. So ultimately, power comes from the votes we cast at a ballot box. So power comes from us. So the more we understand about political power, not textbook glossed over movie versions of political power, but the raw, naked reality of what political power really is, the more I feel, the more informed our votes will be, and therefore, we hope, the better informed and the better our democracy will be. So in each of these books, the first book was about the young Lyndon Johnson coming out of this incredible poverty and humiliation of his youth, and coming out of an area of the United States that was isolated and cut off by a sealed land from the rest of the United States, and somehow coming out of that to become a congressman at the age of 28 and to transform the lives of his congressional district, the 10th congressional district, by bringing them electricity. Before he brought them electricity, they were living lives really like peasants out of the Middle Ages. Women had to haul up water by hand. Every chore had to be done by hand. It seemed impossible, absolutely impossible, to ever get electricity out there. There was only one person per square mile. No one was going to pay to raise those lines. The story of how Johnson got the electricity out there, to me, is one of the noble examples of Lyndon Johnson. Second volume is really about how he always wanted to help poor people, and particularly poor people of color. Goes back all the way when he was in college. He was so poor that between his sophomore and his junior year, he had to drop out of school for a year and teach in what was known as the Mexican school in a little dusty town called Cotulla in Texas. And Johnson, I wrote in that book, no teacher had ever cared if these kids learned or not. This teacher cared. He was very important to him that the kids learn English, so that he would spank the boys and tongue lash the girls whenever he heard them using English instead of Spanish. So you could say, that was just an example of Lyndon Johnson always doing the best job he could in whatever job he had. And that was a characteristic of Lyndon Johnson. But I felt he always really cared. And the reason I felt that was that he didn't only teach the kids, he taught the janitor. The janitor's name was Thomas Coronado. And he said that Johnson thought it was very important for him to learn English. So he bought him a textbook. And every day before school and after school, the two of them would sit on the steps outside the school. And Coronado says, if I have the quote right, Johnson would spell, I would repeat. Johnson would pronounce, I would repeat. Third volume is called Master of the Senate. For 100 years before Lyndon Johnson became majority leader of the United States Senate in 1955, the Senate was the same dysfunctional mess it is today. Johnson becomes a majority leader January 1955. For 6 years, the Senate becomes suddenly the center of governmental ingenuity and creativity and energy in Washington. They write their own bills. The Civil Rights Bill of 1957 is Johnson's bill, not Eisenhower's bill. He passes them. Someone describes him running the Senate, standing at his front row Senate Majority Leader's desk. He's very tall. He's 6'4". His arms are long, even for 6'4". His hands are big, even for the length of his arms. And he's running that Senate like an orchestra conductor. If he has the exact number of votes, he wants the vote called really fast. So he raises his hand right above his head, and the clerk starts to call the roll faster. If he doesn't have quite enough votes, a couple of his senators are being rushed across Washington so that they can cast the votes, he goes like this, and the vote in the Senate is very slow. A journalist wrote about him, my God, he was running the Senate like that. He'd make a gesture and the cloakroom doors would open and two men would come running out. Power enveloped the world. Power enveloped Lyndon Johnson. So we see each of these books, I'm trying to examine a different kind of political power, how the Senate works, how Johnson worked in Congress, that sort of thing. In this last book, the book that I published in May, we see Lyndon Johnson using a new form of political power, the power of the presidency of the United States. He was such a genius in the use of political power, in bending Congress and all Washington to his will, the greatest genius in the use of political power that America produced in the second half of the 20th century. That it's endlessly fascinating, not boring to me, to watch how he's doing it. Over and over again, I find myself saying, look at that, I never knew you could do that, I never knew you could do that. So in this book I've just published, we're examining that kind of political power. Of course, and you remember, he steps into this presidency with no preparation. Today, political scientists, they say that the 11 weeks between Election Day and Inauguration Day is not nearly enough time for a man to prepare himself to be president. 11 weeks isn't long enough. Lyndon Johnson's transition, his preparation, he had 2 hours and 6 minutes from the time he raised his hand on Air Force One and took the oath of office to the time Air Force One landed at Andrews Air Force Base. He had to step off the plane and be president of the United States. And to see him do that, to see him step in with no preparation at all, and at a time, remember, when President Kennedy's entire legislative program, his civil rights bill, his tax cut bill, his Medicare bill, his education bill, all of them were completely stalled in Congress. None of them were going anywhere. None of them were going to pass. To see Johnson step into that position and in really 1 week get them all started on their road to passage, to ramming them through Congress, is to really understand something new about the nature of political genius. It's a lesson in what a president can do if he not only knows all the levers to pull, but has the will, in Johnson's case, a savage, almost vicious, cruel drive. To do it, to win, is to say over and over again, wow, look what he's doing here. I don't say that I succeeded in explaining what he did, but that's what I tried to do in this book. And I think to watch him do that is not only interesting but important too, because of what I said before, the importance of us knowing how political power really works. And there's another reason that I never get tired of doing these books on Lyndon Johnson. Because you're always learning something new. You're always learning something new, even if it's about something about which there have been really not scores and not hundreds, but literally, without exaggeration, thousands of books already written. Books on the assassination, on one of the episodes that's a key episode in this book, the assassination of President Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas. You know, with all the books that had been written about this, not one had examined the assassination in any adequate detail, any adequate that I considered detail in any way, from the standpoint of Lyndon Johnson. It was always about John F. Kennedy. But Lyndon Johnson was in that cavalcade too. The first car in the cavalcade, as you may remember, I'm looking around, I don't know that many of you are old enough to remember, but I'm sure you've seen the newsreels. In the first car are Jack and Jackie. In front of them are sitting John Connally, the Leonine governor of Texas, and his wife, the beautiful Nellie Connally. Nellie Connally, once the sweetheart of the University of Texas and still very beautiful. The next car is the Secret Service car. There's a certain amount of space that the Secret Service wants between each car, 75 feet. In that car, the Secret Service calls it the Queen Mary because it's so heavily armored. Inside it, there are two on the outside, on the running board, there are two Secret Service men holding on. Inside, there are 4 Secret Service men with automatic rifles, which they have concealed on the floor in case of an emergency. But the third car in that cavalcade is Lyndon Johnson's car. That car is 75 feet behind the Secret Service car. In that car, Lyndon Johnson is sitting on the right side in the rear seat. Next to him is Lady Bird Johnson. On the left is the senator from Texas, Ralph Yarborough. And in the front seat on the right side is a character who's going to become very important, a Secret Service agent named Rufus Youngblood. He was a tall, lanky guy from Georgia. So how do you find out, if nothing much has been written about it, what happened with Lyndon Johnson on that day? Well, the first thing you do, of course, is very obvious. You try to interview everyone who was alive. Went down and interviewed John Connolly on his ranch. Still remember, on sitting on the fence, he used to come pick me up at 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the morning. I'd go sit on the fence with him. He had a vast stable of Mexican quarter horses, and the Mexican vaqueros would exercise in the morning. And he talked to me about it. And I remember one thing he said, everyone else, when they heard the first shot, thought it was a balloon bursting or a motorcycle backfire. But I was a hunter. The moment I heard it, I knew it was the crack of a hunting rifle. And I interviewed, Lady Bird and Ralph Yarborough, everyone who was with Lyndon Johnson in Parkland Memorial Hospital afterwards. But I've learned there are always sources that particularly written sources, that no matter how hard you try, you think you've overlooked, that everybody's overlooked. And in the course of doing this, I learned almost by accident that it was a Secret Service regulation that if you were a member of the special agent, of the special detail, if you were a member of the special detail of the vice presidential detail, or the presidential detail, and there was any incident that day, and to the Secret Service, an assassination is just an incident, like some nut running out from the throng. You had to, before you went to bed next, you had to type out for your chief in Washington every detail of that incident that you remembered that day. So I wrote the Secret Service. The Secret Service being the Secret Service never replied. I telephoned the Secret Service Public Relations Office, the Secret Service being the Secret Service never replied. But then I thought of something. I had learned that one of Lyndon Johnson's characteristics was that he always ordered a copy of everything in his files. And I asked the director of the Lyndon Johnson Library, is there anywhere in this library the Secret Service agents' reports of that day? And 5 minutes later, there they were on my desk. They're all bound together. There are 23 of them. There were 23 agents that day. And it's just like a brown, cardboard folder with a ribbon on the side. And it's titled Report of the United States Secret Service on the Assassination of President Kennedy. From these reports, you can find out quite a lot. Take one report only today. The Secret Service agent in charge of the vice presidential detail, secret agent in charge of protecting Lyndon Johnson. That day, his name was, as I said, was Rufus Youngblood. Now, he was riding in the front seat of Johnson's car. You have to get a picture of what was happening. They had turned into Dallas's main street with the office buildings and department stores on each side. From each department store, from each window, people were jammed, yelling. The sidewalks were crowded from the edge of the sidewalk and the police barricades back to the buildings. Every time Jack waved, they surged forward against the police. Every time Jackie waved and smiled, they surged forward a lot more enthusiastically. So the Secret Service the car had to slow down from 20 miles an hour to 15 to 10 to 5. Suddenly they turn the corner and they're out from under the big buildings. They're on Dealey Plaza, a very crowded, empty space. And there's a sharp cracking sound. As I said before, most people think it's a motorcycle backfire or a balloon bursting, but Connolly knows. Youngblood doesn't know what it is. But he suddenly hears the noise, and what happens then, what he does then, is in his report. Statement of Rufus W. Youngblood to Chief concerning details of events occurring in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd. He sees what he says, quote, not normal movements in the president's car. He says he sees the president, President Kennedy, start to tilt toward the left in a funny way. Now we know why he tilted to the left. We know now why, when he was hit with the first shot in the neck, which didn't kill him, we know why he couldn't fall down to the floor of the car. He had, of course, this terrible back, used to wear a brace all the time, almost all the time, with steel stays. But when he had a very long day of campaigning ahead of him, he would reinforce the brace by taking an ace bandage and wrapping it in a figure eight around his thighs and then around his back to give him added support. So he's really held in place. He couldn't fall down, so he tilts to the left. Youngblood said he sees these not normal movements. In the next instant, he sees something else. In the car ahead of him, the Secret Service car, he sees an agent rising to his feet with an automatic rifle in his hand, looking around in a confused way, trying to figure out what happened. And we know what Youngblood does yet next in that instant. I wrote it this way. Whirling in his seat, Youngblood shouted. Lady Bird said he shouted in a voice I had never heard him use before. Get down, get down. And grabbing Johnson's right shoulder, he yanked him roughly down toward the floor in the center of the car as he almost leaped over the back of the front seat and threw his body over the vice president's body, shouting again, get down, get down. By the time, only a matter of 8 seconds later, that the next two show-up reports had cracked out, everyone knew what they were now. Lyndon Johnson was down on the floor on the back seat of the car, curled over on his right side. The sudden loud show-up sound, the hand suddenly grabbing his shoulder and pulling him down. Now he was on the floor, his face on the floor, with the weight of a big man lying on top of him, pressing him down. Lyndon Johnson would never forget his knees in my back and his elbows in my back. Youngblood has a shortwave radio strapped to his shoulder to keep him in touch with the other cars in the procession. And out of the gabble of noises, Johnson hears words. He's hit, he's hit. Get out of here. Hospital. Youngblood sees ahead of him a Secret Service man, Clint Hill, who was on the running board of the Secret Service car, run up toward the Kennedy car and leap onto the back hood. He grabs a handhold and leans over to see what's down in the on the floor of the back seat, and he makes this gesture. Youngblood knows his best chance of protection is to stay close. No one knows if it's a conspiracy. We're only 1 year past the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's constant tension. No one knows if this is a conspiracy and Russia or Cuba were behind him. He knows his best chance, and Connolly was hit. Who knows if Johnson would have been the next person aimed at if Youngblood hadn't thrown his life over him. He knows his best chance of protection is to keep very close to that Secret Service car with the automatic rifles. So he tells his driver, a Texas highway patrolman named Herschel Jacks, close it up. And Jacks, the cars race up an expressway. They race down the expressway and squeal into the hospital. And all this time, Youngblood is Jacks is keeping his car within feet of the Secret Service car. He says to Johnson, when we get to this hospital, don't stop for anything. Don't look around. We're going to get you someplace secure. So Johnson is yanked out of the car by Secret Service men and run as fast as he can out of the emergency bay so that he never sees Kennedy's car. He never sees what's on the floor of the car, which is Kennedy lying there with his head in Jackie's lap, and Jackie's lap covered with blood. And they run him down one corridor, up another corridor, down another one, looking for something safe. They finally come to the last thing they can come to, which is called the Parkland Minor Medical Center. There's one big cubicle divided up by two Muslim curtains. He puts Johnson against the back wall with Lady Bird beside him. He stands in front of him. Lady Bird was to say, "Always there was you, Rufus." Youngblood stands in front of him. He puts two other Secret Service men in the intervening cubicle, and he puts one man at the door of the corridor with the instructions, "Don't let any human being pass here unless you know his face yourself." For 40 minutes, Lyndon Johnson is standing there. No one brings him a bit of information. Twice he asks Youngblood to send out and find out what's going on with President Kennedy. Both times the only word that comes back is that doctors are still working on the president. After 40 minutes, Lady Bird says, Kenny O'Donnell, Kennedy's closest aide, comes in, and she says, seeing the stricken face of Kenny O'Donnell, who loved him, we knew. A moment later, another Kennedy aide comes in and walks over to Lyndon Johnson and says, "Mr. President." It's fascinating to watch the transformation in Johnson, who for 3 years had been humiliated and kept powerless by the Kennedys as vice president. During these 40 minutes, his changes. Lady Bird says it's like his face turned into a graven bronze image. And others who were in that room say sort of the same thing. It's not a handsome face. Lyndon Johnson was never handsome like Jack Kennedy, but it was a very tough face. And he starts giving orders the minute he's addressed as Mr. President. The Secret Service agents say, "We have to get you back to Washington. We have to get you into the White House. We don't know if it's a conspiracy. That's the only place we can keep you safe." Lyndon Johnson says in a very decisive way, "No." He's not leaving, he says, until he can take Jackie Kennedy with him. They say Jackie Kennedy won't leave before she can leave with her husband's body. He says, then we'll go to the plane, Air Force One, we'll wait for him, but we're not leaving Dallas. The scene on the plane had also never been described from Lyndon Johnson's point of view. He's the President of the United States. The whole thing, when you think of his presidency, is sort of incredible. Not one reporter follows him out of the hospital when he's going to Air Force One. They're all waiting for information on President Kennedy. One photographer, Cecil Stoughton, the White House photographer, catches a glimpse of his going, but no one else even follows him, so no one knows where he is. Then Jack Valenti rounds up 3 reporters, and they go tearing through the streets of Dallas toward Air Force One, and they've realized where Johnson is, and they beg the policeman who's driving the car to let them call their city desks to notify somebody, but radio silence has to be maintained. So for about an hour, we don't really know the time, but for about an hour and a quarter, the United States does not have any idea where their president is. I wanted to talk to everyone in that room. I mean, you learn things when you talk. In the back of the room, if you look at the photograph, you see the curly head of a young woman, and she's not looking like everyone else, Lyndon Johnson. She's looking away. Her name is Marie Famer, and she's Johnson's personal secretary. And she said to me, you know, what he taught you was whatever you had to do, you did it. And he wanted her to check the oath of the office, so he was getting the words exactly right, and that's what she's doing. A reporter comes on board. They had seen Johnson when he was only being humiliated as vice president and ridiculed by the Kennedys. You know, they used to call him Rufus Cornpone. And they had a nickname for him and Lady Bird, Colonel Cornpone and his little pork chop. Everyone treated him with derision. So the reporter says, I had never seen Lyndon Johnson as president of the United States, so in a position of authority. I thought of him as Rufus Cornpone. It never occurred to me that he would be able to be called President of the United States. I never thought I would think of him as President of the United States. And he says, but suddenly, watching him in the center of the room, taking command in this confused situation, I had no trouble thinking of him as president anymore. You know, it's interesting. I talk about trying to find everybody who was in the room. So there I was. A lot of the people, there were 28 people crowded into this room, 26 by 26, and I'm trying to get each one who's not dead and make sure, and it seems to me I've talked to everyone, but all the time I knew I was forgetting something and I couldn't remember who I was forgetting. And then I remembered the photographer, and his name was Cecil Stout, and as I said, he was the White House photographer. And I said, oh my God, how could I forget him for 20 years? And now he must be dead. So you look in the National Telephone Directory on your computer, and there's a Cecil Stout in Washington, and you call with your heart in your throat, and you say, Mrs. Stout, my name is Robert Caro, and I'm writing books on Lyndon Johnson. And she says, oh, Cecil was waiting for you to call. And he told me a lot of things that were fascinating. I'll just tell you one. Look at those pictures again, the most famous pictures in American political history. And you'll see that Jackie Kennedy is only photographed from the knees up. The reason was from the knees down, her skirt was covered with Kennedy's blood. And he says it would be disrespectful to do that. And Stoughton says the same thing that the reporter says. Stoughton's quote is, he was big, big. I don't mean just that he towered over everyone in the room. It was the way he was the center of attention, the way he took command. And on the flight back, is there a conspiracy? The headlines the next day say, Oswald applied for Soviet citizenship. Oswald visited Cuban embassy in Mexican City. Was there a conspiracy? Connally had been hit. Would Johnson have been hit? Was he going to be a target on the way back? As Air Force One is going across the country, at every fighter base, the fighter planes are on the runways with their engines running, the pilots strapped into the cockpit, and in the radar shacks at the bases are men huddled over the radar screens, waiting to see if any blip approaches Air Force One. And there's crying on the plane. Kennedy's people are crying in the cockpit in the front. Lady Bird is in the back. One of the reporters wrote, you've heard of strong men crying. We had it there that day. And you hear about incidents that occur on the flight. Bobby Kennedy, of course, hated Lyndon Johnson, and Lyndon Johnson hated Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy is having lunch that day. He lives in a big colonial house in McLean, Virginia, white painted house. Then there's a lawn floating down to the, going down to the swimming pool. And he's having lunch that day with his wife Ethel and Robert Morgenthau, who's district attorney of New York. And two things, Morgenthau tells me, happened simultaneously. Simultaneously, the telephone rings at a table on the other side of the pool. And as the telephone rings, Morgenthau sees one of the painters, the house is being painted, one of the painters who's painting the house clap a transistor radio to his ear. and suddenly start with a look of horror running down the lawn toward them. And of course, the call was for J. Edgar Hoover, telling him, Robert Kennedy, that his brother was dead. And you learn about the call because these two men hated each other. And now Johnson calls Kennedy 15 minutes after Hoover to ask, what is the procedure for becoming president of the United States? How do you get sworn in? What's the oath of office? I asked Marie Famer, and Kennedy patches Nicholas Katzenbach, his number 2 man at the Justice Department, into the call so that he can give the oath of office. And I asked Marie Famer, what were the voices on that call like? And she says, Katzenbach's voice was like steel. Kennedy's was not. He shouldn't have been doing this. That's what I kept thinking. He shouldn't have been doing this. Katzenbach, a very calm man, wasn't calm when he said to me he should never have made that call. But Johnson wanted a lot of revenge that day. Of course, he never wins revenge. When Johnson is fighting Bobby Kennedy, he never wins revenge completely, because what happens at Air Force Base is that Johnson has made arrangements for the coffin, which is strapped in the back of the plane, to go off the back ramp at the back of the plane, with he and Jackie Kennedy going off together as a symbol of the continuity that he considered very important. But Robert Kennedy is hiding at Air Force Base, and as the plane comes up and the steps are put up on the front and back doors simultaneously, Robert Kennedy races up those steps and pushes his way back down the plane, past the Secret Service men, and past Lyndon Johnson, takes Jackie's hand, so that when the coffin comes off, it's Robert Kennedy and Jackie Kennedy who are coming off together. And Johnson is left standing. The lift brings the coffin down. There's no way to get to the ground, and Johnson is left standing there with Lady Bird until the coffin drives away. So there are 100 facts about that day that we all thought we knew everything about, that could help us in an attempt to understand Lyndon Johnson. And of course, there are the days right after this day, which I won't go into now, where he takes Kennedy's programs, lifts them up, and brings them through Congress, gets them started in an act of political genius. So the more detail you learn about how Lyndon Johnson did it, about what he did with Congress and what he did to Congress, the more amazing the accomplishment seems. He sees there's only one lever that can get a civil rights bill passed. No bill has been passed for 82 years. And he grabs that lever and leans into it in a way no president had ever done. During this brief transition period, this passage of power, Lyndon Johnson not only rescued his predecessor's program, but he launches this program of his own, a war against poverty, a crusade for a noble end that would, had he succeeded, have transformed America. Now, that is not the whole story of Lyndon Johnson's presidency. There is another volume yet to come. Vietnam is yet to come. The story of how the war on poverty and the Great Society, how the great dreams are to be submerged in Vietnam, is yet to come. But what I try to do in this volume, what I think we can see with a rare clarity in those 47 days, by watching how Lyndon Johnson took hold of presidential power and so quickly began to use that power that for ends so monumental, is the immensity an American president possesses if he knows the levers of power and wants to push them. Thank you very much.
Now your work on the Power Broker informed and educated you on passages to power?
Well, of course, Robert Moses, I don't know how many of you have read that book. Robert Moses was a political genius in a very different way, you know. Lyndon Johnson we think of as physical. He put his arm around you, he grabbed your lapel, he leaned into you, you know, with his face until he persuaded you of what he wanted. Robert Moses, you know, the gesture was the opposite, like this. He didn't want to be touched. He had a real contempt for human beings. So he did everything intellectually by drafting laws that no one understood, but they both were aiming for the same thing. Yes, that's a terrific question. Yes, sir.
I'm curious what you found most surprising about that day.
What? Oh, I've never been asked that before. What's most surprising about that day? I suppose what's most surprising about that day, I guess, is Johnson's attitude, you know, because often when there wasn't a crisis, he was hysterical. You know, they used to say if he had a cold, you'd think he had pneumonia, you know. But Lady Bird told me once, in a crisis, he's a good man to have around. And I thought the fact that when Youngblood is asked, how does Johnson act when he doesn't know what's going on around him, and he uses the word calm, you know, I think that is really striking to me. Yes, sir.
Have you ever felt that, given the decades spent with Lyndon Johnson, that somehow, in an existentialist sense, that he might be exercising power over you beyond?
Well, my wife says I yell at her a lot more. You know, you never know about that. That's a terrific question. But it's one that, you know, you're almost afraid to think of what's happening to you. Is doing this. Yes, sir. Can everybody hear the questions? Okay.
One of the things you describe so well, and I enjoy all your books,
Thank you.
is Johnson's strategic decision in which bill to push and what, through the course of the legislative session, to do. And I always think of who's president now and how they do that in comparison. Is there any president since Johnson who had that ability, even though you said he really wasn't prepared to be president? In some ways, he was best prepared to be president because he knew how to make that work. And the things we're looking at now, we just don't seem to have people, regardless of how you feel about the politics, of knowing strategically what to do and when to do it.
Yeah, well, that's another great question. That's not so easy to answer. You know, the genius that he has in the first moment, you know, right after the presidency, if I can just digress for a second, for 3 or 4 days after the presidency, he has to give the address to Congress. And he's not even in the White House. He's still in his private house. And he has 3 or 4 of his advisors are there talking about what should be in the first talk to Congress. And they're saying, whatever you do, don't mention civil rights. Kennedy couldn't get it through. You'll lose up all your political power. You're never going to get it through. It's a noble cause, but it's a lost cause. And Lyndon Johnson says to them, what's a presidency for then? So he picks up civil rights and gets it passed. He does other things that are really unique for a president. I'm not saying he's the best president, of course, even in domestic affairs, because Vietnam is to come. But he does have, in the very instant, the day after the assassination, he calls in the legislative leaders and he says, what's the next item? And they say it's this amendment to, it's a really minor amendment to a minor bill. It has done something to do with the Import-Export Bank and a wheat deal with Russia. And they all say it's not important, and anyway, we've got the votes to counter. And Johnson, in an instant, without thinking about it, says, It's very important because they've thought they can beat the president. I've got to treat them there. I've got to teach them there's a new president. And then, because he's the greatest vote counter, he actually asks the two Democratic leaders, Mansfield and Humphrey, who tell me the votes. And they say, oh, we've got plenty of votes. But Johnson's never that way. He says, tell me the votes. And when they tell it to him, he realizes they don't have a vote, and he's going to lose again. So he stays up all night, browbeating people, threatening people, bribing people, cajoling people, charming people to get the votes. But when he gets the majority, it's not enough, and he doesn't go to bed. He says, I've got to murder this bill to teach Congress the lesson. And he gets that in an instant. And I wrote, and I think it's true, at that moment, power started to flow back from Capitol Hill to the White House. Yes. Did you want? You? Yes.
Thank you so much for talking about us.
I'm sorry?
Oh, I just said thank you for coming. I was just wondering, when you're not researching Johnson, what do you read? Do you read magazines? What magazines, or blogs, or fiction, or?
Well, I read a 19th century British novelist named Anthony Trollope, which... Well, I'm so glad you're applauding, because a lot of people don't even seem to know who Trollope is anymore, but I love him. Yes. Yes. I saw one. Yes, sir.
In reading the 1960 campaign, it seemed that his political instincts as far as the national electoral scene fell far short of his instincts for legislative politics.
Yes.
And I wanted to know if you agreed with that, and if so, why there was that gap in his political genius.
Yes, well, these are very good questions, which means they're not easy to answer real quickly. That's true. I mean, Johnson was the most decisive of men, but for 2 years he couldn't bring himself to run against Jack Kennedy. In 1958, Johnson is the most powerful Democrat in the country. He is the Senate majority, the mighty Senate majority leader. He has the nomination. He doesn't realize that for 2 years, Kennedy is going around the country taking that away from him. This young senator is taking it away from him. And when he does realize, he still doesn't act. The reason, the people who know Johnson, I don't want to say this myself because I don't know it, the people who know Johnson all think they know the reason that he's afraid to fail, because the single great fact of Lyndon Johnson's life is his father's failure, that he idolized his father, who was a state legislator and a populist legislator. Lyndon said the happiest days of his life was following his father, going from farm to farm, getting the votes. And then all of a sudden his father makes one mistake. He pays too much for the Johnson Ranch, and he loses everything. And for the rest of Johnson's life, not only are they so poor that every month they have to learn, they've lost the ranch, and they're afraid of losing the only home they have each month. But his father is the ridicule of the hill country. And there's one speaking Texas barbecue where someone says, Sam Johnson's a good man, all right, but he's got no sense. So Johnson has to listen to this. For the rest of his life, people feel the great fear of his life is failure. So he was afraid to fail. He got to really try for presidency and fail. Yes.
So I moved to New York in 1987, and I couldn't figure out why it was that the Triborough Bridge comes in at 125th Street. So my uncle said, well, if you want to know why New York looks the way it looks,
just read The Power Broker, so thank you for that. In your last book, you describe, once Johnson gets the power, he embarks upon voting rights, the Civil Rights Acts, the Great Society, which is antithetical to his he was an acolyte of the Southern Democrats that prevented all of that stuff from happening for a really long time.
Yes.
So my question is, why did he do that? Did he do it because he suddenly gained some moral insight? Or did he do it because he realized that that was the fastest way that he could, there was an opportunity there and he could get himself on whatever Mount Rushmore was? Why did he suddenly change from supporting the Southern Democrats
Right.
to doing these Great Society?
Well, as I said, I think I told the story about when he was teaching in Catula again tonight, and he taught the janitor. Did I tell that story? Yeah, tonight. I think he always wanted to do it. There was always something, there's a compassion in him for helping poor people, and particularly poor people of color, that goes all the way back to his youth, and is a true compassion. However, I do say in the books that whenever compassion collided with collision, it was never compassion that won. And for 20 years, from the time he came to Congress in 1937 to the time he runs for president in 57, his political interest, the only way he's going to get ahead, is to ally himself to the Southern senators. And that means to make them believe, and of course not just to cast the votes, but to make them believe that he's really on their side, that he feels the same way about African Americans as they do. And he convinces them of that completely. I remember I went down to see a senator named Herman Talmadge. I don't know if any of you know his name, who was the worst of these racists. I mean, it was quite a trip down from New York. You get Atlanta. So he had sent, although he'd been out of power for like 20 years, he sent as my chauffeur for the weekend the state Democratic chairman of Georgia. So you drove down to see him on the Herman Talmadge Memorial Highway, and you got off on the exit for Lake Talmadge. And you drove to Lake Talmadge, and there's this great mansion, and the senator says, and his butler says, the senator is waiting for you in the library, So he was dying. This was the very last weeks of his life. And he really was very frank with me about talking to me. And the question that answers your question is that he had been telling me how he knew Johnson was on his side, And I said, well, what was Lyndon Johnson's view of black man and white man? And he said, slave and master, I said, so how did you feel when Lyndon Johnson got up as president and said, our first job is to pass a civil rights bill, And he said, betrayed. And that's the way the Southern senators as a whole felt. He stayed, he put this mask on for 20 years. But when the time came he could take it off, he took it off. Yes, sir. Oh, sure. I'm sorry. Okay, sure.
This probably seems like an impossible dream, but suppose Johnson, you've completed your work on Johnson. Is there another figure existing that compels you or interests you, or that you would recommend to somebody to look at?
Well, I have one more book I'd like to do, but I'm superstitious. That's the only question I'll take a pass on. I think if I... Okay. Thank you all very much.